Good evening, and welcome to tonight's All Candidates Forum for the riding of Vancouver Granville, hosted by Vancouver Unitarians. My name is Diane Brown, and I'm the president of Vancouver Unitarians, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you into our sanctuary this evening for tonight's forum, our beautiful, newly renovated heritage sanctuary here at the corner of 49th and Oak in Vancouver. In convening this debate, Vancouver Unitarians wish to contribute to our civic dialogue and encourage democratic participation. This is a long tradition here at our UCV campus, and our congregation is very proud of our history of engaging with the wider community and encouraging pluralism, diversity, and the free exchange of ideas. We recognize that tonight's forum is on the unceded stolen lands of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and we are grateful for their stewardship of this land and to be here as uninvited guests. Unlike the All Candidates Forum we convened here in 2019, which doesn't seem that long ago, the hall was full to capacity. Well, tonight we do not have an in-person audience, but thanks to our great tech team here at the sanctuary, we are live streaming to you on YouTube from ucv.im/allcandidatesforum, and this conversation will be recorded and widely available on that link. So let's get started. We have 3 of the 5 candidates on the ballot in this riding for Vancouver Granville here with us this evening, and they are Anjali Appadurai of the New Democratic Party, Kaylin Chi of the Conservative Party, and Damien Jewett of the People's Party. Now, we did make every effort to confirm the attendance of Tlaib Noor Mohammed of the Liberal Party and Imtiaz Poppet of the Green Party, but their campaigns informed us that they were not able to attend this evening. We will begin with 3-minute opening statements from each candidate, followed by 6 questions that everyone will have a chance to address. And we will conclude tonight's forum with a 2-minute closing statement from each candidate. So, in alphabetical order, let's begin with Anjali. You have 3 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you so much, Diane, and thanks so much for hosting us here on these unceded Coast Salish lands. It's a real honor to be here and an honor to actually engage with my fellow candidates. My name is Anjali Appadurai, and I come from an activism background. I've been a climate justice activist for over 10 years now, and I got my start in activism in an unusual place. I started by working within the United Nations Climate Convention to bring an equity perspective to the multilateral climate talks. And that was just over 10 years ago, and I was able to witness firsthand the deep injustice that climate change is and the way it disproportionately impacts the most vulnerable amongst us. So that was a really eye-opening experience for me to be able to learn about climate change from a global context of colonialism and injustice and systemic inequity. That steeled my resolve to continue working on this issue for as long as it would take. But I wanted to do it from my home in BC. So I returned to Vancouver, and I have since been working in the environmental nonprofit sector with organizations including West Coast Environmental Law, which was in the riding for many years, and most recently, the Sierra Club of BC and the Climate Emergency Unit. I also recently founded an organization, the Padma Center for Climate Justice, and that is focused on encouraging those of us like me from diasporas from the Global South to engage more meaningfully in questions of climate justice. So to me, we are living through a time of intersecting crises, a crisis of inequality, crisis of climate change, and the recent COVID-19 pandemic. And to me, the only way we win is by centering equity in our approach and by tackling these intersecting crises as a holistic package. So that's what the core of my platform is. It's about moving at the speed and scale of the crisis that's required while making sure that no one gets left behind. I'm new to politics. It's the first time I've entered politics, and I entered because I believe that we have an imperative in this moment to act with real bold vision, a forward-looking vision for a more just and equitable society. And that's what I'm committed to do. That's what I've committed my life to do. And through this avenue of entering the electoral political system, backed by the incredible progressive community in Vancouver, I'm excited to see what we can do next.
Thank you, Anjali. Kaylin, you have 3 minutes.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. My name is Kaylin. I'm the Conservative candidate for the riding of Vancouver Granville. It's a riding that's near and dear to me. It's where I went to school, where I grew up, and it's where I now have my legal practice, where I've worked with many residents here and have a deep and personal understanding of some of the challenges facing the community here in Vancouver Granville. Though I've worked in politics and in government, I've never considered myself to be a politician. And I've decided to run this time because I truly believe that we need change. We need change in our community. We need change in our government and the way that it's run. And we need change in Canada. Canadians have given Trudeau many chances to live up to his big campaign promises, and there's been no shortage of money spent. In fact, by 2023, the Trudeau and his Prime Minister Trudeau and his Liberal government would have spent more than $660 billion, which is more than all the prime ministers combined since 1867. Yet our lives have not gotten better. The prices of housing, food, and fuel have risen. We have unemployment at its highest in the G7. We have inflation that is the highest that it's been in the last 2 decades, and our Indigenous communities still don't have drinking water. Unlike the Liberals and the NDP, the Conservatives understand that money does not grow on trees, that we need to have a strong economy in order to tackle the challenges facing British Columbians today, including housing affordability, including climate change, and inflation. And so we need to grow the economy, and we need to live within our means. If elected, the Conservatives will work towards recovering the $1 million jobs lost during the pandemic. We will tackle corruption and increase transparency in the government by enacting an anti-corruption legislation. We will implement a Canadian mental health plan. We will secure affordable housing by building 1 million homes over the next 3 years, and we will balance the budget over the next decade. Conservatives under Erin O'Toole have a platform consisting of real goals and tangible solutions to the problems that we face today. It's time for a change, and I hope that we can count on your support so that we can elect a strong Conservative government and restore transparency and fiscal accountability in Canada again.
Thank you, Kaylin. Damien, you have 3 minutes.
Well, thank you for inviting me to this event. C'est un plaisir d'être ici aujourd'hui. It's a pleasure to speak to the Vancouver Granville community and present the People's Party plan for ensuring a strong and prosperous future for Canada and free future. Just a bit about the People's Party. The People's Party of Canada is a Canadian populist party with conservative and classical liberal principles and some libertarian influences. Populist in this case meaning we're fighting for everyday Canadians, not elitists, not lobbyists, and not special interest groups. We work to represent people directly. We believe in small government, lowering taxes, ending corporate welfare, and supporting small businesses. And we believe in maximizing the freedoms that Canadians enjoy. The PPC will always put Canadians first. Just a little bit about me. I'm originally from out east, grew up in BC. I went to school here at UBC. I studied computer science and eventually went back out east to get my master's degree in computer science. I've worked in the industry for 10 years as an IT consultant. Me personally, I'm not a politician. I'm just a regular, everyday working Canadian who cares deeply about his country. As I mentioned, I work as an IT consultant and web developer. and my day job is not easy. I'm here today not because I want to be, but because I feel I have to be. I do this on my own time, outside of work, with some donations and my own money. Our country is slipping away at an alarming rate, and establishment parties keep promising more and more spending and wasteful programs that dig us deeper and deeper into a hole. My fear is that my children and my children's children will be paying for the problems and wasteful spending solutions of our generation. My fear is that Canada will be in no position to deal with the next global crisis whenever it should occur, whether it's a recession, another pandemic, or something else. Ms. Chi said that they want to eliminate the deficit in 10 years. We want to do it in one mandate. We think that's the responsible thing to do. So I hope today we can talk a little bit about the COVID response and all of the terrible decisions the Liberal government have made, and also talk a little bit about vaccine passports and our freedoms. In Vancouver Granville, being such a beautiful neighborhood, my fear is that people have fallen asleep to some of the issues that we see across Canada. So today, I'm going to present you with great policies that we have in our platform for the economy, for fiscal responsibility, for rights and freedoms, freedom of speech, trade, and even policies to help our Indigenous brothers and sisters. Thank you for taking the time to listen to our plan, and we look forward to a great discussion here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for those opening remarks. Now, each candidate will have 2 minutes to respond to the upcoming questions, and then there will be a second round of responses, which will give each candidate the opportunity to respond for 1 minute to what they have just heard the other candidates say. For the first of our 6 thematic questions, we will proceed in reverse alphabetical order, starting with Damien Jewett of the People's Party. So Damien, during the pandemic, according to one study, Canada's billionaires have seen their overall wealth increase by $78 billion. If elected, would you support the introduction of a wealth tax in Canada? You have 2 minutes to respond.
Well, thanks for the question. No, typically we're not in favor of a wealth tax. I think this goes with free market economy. I think in many cases, billionaires actually don't necessarily want to get richer. Once you have billions of dollars, there's no point in being greedy anymore. I mean, what's another 10 billion going to get you other than growing your company and building jobs? So generally speaking, no, I don't think that we would support a wealth tax in that sense. But we do have some great policies on the economy and on fiscal responsibility, and I'd like to take the rest of my time to just cover some of those. So a People's Party would eliminate corporate subsidies and other inefficient government interventions. So this includes things like bailing out of failing companies, regional development grants, conditional loans and guarantees. And we would gradually reduce over the course of one mandate the corporate income tax from its current 15% down to 10%. When completed, this measure would make about $9.5 billion available to businesses, allowing them to increase salaries or invest in productivity improvements. We also want to push down inflation, so that's another big one that we'll talk about today. But essentially, we want to have the Bank of Canada's target inflation rate at 0%, and this would help all Canadians be able to afford life moving past the pandemic and into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Damien. Kaylin, you have 2 minutes.
The NDP will simply tell Canadians that we can solve all of our country's problems by imposing a wealth tax on all of our billionaires. As someone who is not a billionaire and who works for a living, if it were the case that we could solve the problems of affordable housing, solve climate change, and bring water to our Indigenous communities, then my voice would be the loudest in the room in support of a wealth tax. Unfortunately, that is just not the case. The wealth tax will not bring back the 1 million jobs that Canadians lost during the pandemic. Small businesses have been forced to shut down during COVID-19, and main streets all across Vancouver are hollowed out. The Conservatives have a plan to get Canadian workers back to work from coast to coast, from sector to sector. That is our number one priority. So to help small businesses get back on their feet, the Canada's Conservatives will be introducing a number of tax incentives, including a small business loan of up to $200,000, as well as tax credits of 5% for capital investments over the next 2 years.
Thank you, Kaylin. Anjali, you have 2 minutes.
As the party that has the wealth tax on the table, to me, I mean, the point around billionaires not wanting to make more money, it may be true, but the point is that our system is set up so that billionaires do make more money with doing very little at all. And that's why their wealth increased by $78 billion over the course of a pandemic, while millions of Canadians were out of work or in financial crises or in financial instability. Actually, a wealth tax is not a niche proposal. Canadian voters show an all-time high support rate of 89% for the wealth tax, including 83% of Conservative voters, which is huge, and it shows that the time has come for Canadians to join in their shared value of paying a fair share and to pay a modest 1% tax on the 0.1 of the 1% of earners in Canada, those making $10 million and above. And so the wealth tax is a modest proposal that would redistribute money throughout the economy to where it's needed most. And I think Canadians, even Conservative voters, 83% of them understand that redistributing wealth from the very top, where our laws benefit those at the very top, has a myriad of positive effects on the economy and for all Canadians, not just the most vulnerable amongst us, but for middle-class Canadians as well.
Thank you. Damien, you now have an additional minute to respond to the other candidates on this issue if you wish.
Sure, yeah. Just add some extra points here. I mean, right now, like, we're in extreme debt. It's $1.2 trillion. That's roughly $34,000 for every man, woman, and child in Canada. And both of these parties want to make that worse. It's getting to the point of no return. So we really need to get this under control. We need to reintroduce fiscal responsibility into our country. We need to get the deficit down within one mandate. And we need to get the debt down so that our children aren't riddled with taxes for generations. We also need to fight inflation, because that's just a tax for that disproportionately affects low-income people and people on fixed incomes. And we're really the only party that's willing to do that. You've seen the Trudeau Liberals printing something like $400 billion to fund all of the CERB checks and all of the COVID measures. And that's just going to cause more and more inflation and make life more expensive for all Canadians.
Thank you. Kaylin, you now have an extra minute to comment on this issue.
The NDP simply has no plan to pay Canada's debts other than imposing a wealth tax on billionaires. And as I stated before, this is not the solution to prosperity. It is simply not sustainable. If we look at what has happened around the world, in 1990, 12 countries had a wealth tax. Today, only 7 countries have a wealth tax. It's simply not effective. Canada's Conservatives are committed to growing the economy. That is the only way to get us out of this crisis. We can only make more money to support these social programs by growing the economic pie, to supporting our small businesses, by ensuring that our industries thrive, by creating new industries such as green industries, so that we can work towards a sustainable future. We need to support workers who are low-income families. We need to provide, the support that they need and the infrastructure that they need to obtain better jobs. And we need to build the infrastructure in Canada so that we can create more jobs and more stable jobs in the economy.
Thank you. Anjali, you have an extra minute.
I don't think there's much more for me to say on this popular policy of a wealth tax, except that the NDP fully supports a creation of jobs across the country and commits to creating 1 million new jobs in a first mandate, because that's absolutely essential to growing our economy as well. And all of this has to happen within the constraints of climate change, because money doesn't grow on trees, but trees don't grow on a burned planet. So we can't keep extracting from the earth in order to grow the economic pie. We have to redistribute money throughout the economy so that everybody gets a fair share.
Thank you. Speaking of climate change and the environment, the next question is this. Do you support the Trans Mountain Pipeline? And, more generally, do you support continuing to provide government subsidies to the fossil fuel industries? We will start with Kaylin Chi of the Conservatives. Kaylin, you have 2 minutes.
Well, the Conservatives have acknowledged and recognized that climate change is a real problem. It's a real problem that is not just national, but also global, and we need to work with the largest polluting countries, including US, China, and India, in order to solve this problem. But the Conservatives also recognize that Canada is a world leader in clean energy, with BC and Alberta as centers of excellence, and we need to build a green economy. Unlike the NDP and the Liberals, the Conservatives plan on solving climate change with an approach that does not make Canadians choose economy over the environment. It's not a dichotomy. We can have both. Trudeau's carbon tax is hurting low-income individuals, so the Conservatives will be replacing that with a low-carbon savings account. And we believe that we cannot simply solve climate change by reducing oil production. Currently, we're importing oil from foreign countries such as US and Saudi Arabia, which are much less sustainable and much dirtier than Canadian oil. So Conservatives are committed to transitioning into clean liquefied natural gas as a transition fuel. Furthermore, Canada lacks the infrastructure for green living, and Conservatives are committed to building the infrastructure we need for a more resilient electric grid and to employ new clean technologies, including nuclear, hydrogen, and renewables.
Thank you. Anjali, do you support the Trans Mountain Pipeline and the continued government subsidies to fossil fuel industries? You have 2 minutes.
The NDP has always opposed the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and I personally have always opposed this pipeline. I think it was a terrible project to begin with that did not promise long-term and sustainable jobs. In fact, one estimate in BC showed that in BC, while the Kinder Morgan pipeline, as it was known back then, would provide a few hundred temporary contracts, it would only provide 50 long-term permanent jobs. And that's a shocking number given the investment that has gone into it. And of course, a federal investment of $20 billion and counting on a pipeline is a public investment. It's a tax dollars investment. And so that shows that there's a direct policy choice that's being made. The government isn't against public investment. They just chose to invest in a pipeline that would lock us in to our already very weak climate targets. Canada is the worst country in the G7 in terms of meeting its climate targets. It's worse than the US, it's worse than the EU, and it's on, we're almost the laughingstock of the world when it comes to meeting our climate targets. So buying a pipeline a couple of days after declaring a climate emergency was a very hypocritical move on the part of the Trudeau government. And on the topic of fossil fuel subsidies, we absolutely need to stop propping up a dying industry. The fossil fuel industry needs to be sunsetted and that money reinvested into clean energy, renewable energy systems, and thousands of good, clean, dignified jobs.
Thank you. Damien, do you support the Trans Mountain Pipeline and fossil fuel subsidies? You have 2 minutes.
Yes, the People's Party of Canada supports pipelines, including the Trans Mountain Pipeline. This issue combines a lot of different issues, everything from climate to economy, even human rights, and I'll get into that. But first of all, I just want to say, like, in our debate the other night with the Green Party candidate, Mr. Popop, kept saying things like, if we can buy a pipeline, why can't we buy social housing? Or if we can buy a pipeline, why can't we buy this or that? And, the answer there is pipelines generate revenue and profits. So, I mean, I don't understand why that's so hard to comprehend. But beyond that, we believe that pipelines have the ability to help our Indigenous communities. We've seen this in places like Kitimat, where BCMLA and former Haisla Nation elected chief, Ellis Ross, created prosperity for his nation through implementation of a liquid natural gas pipeline. So we think that we can replicate that model across the country and help Indigenous communities. We also see no reason why we ship oil in from Saudi Arabia, which costs burning fossil fuels to get it here, when we could pipeline it across the country in a much more efficient way. Quebec says they don't want a pipeline going through their province, but what's the alternative? Shipping in oil from Saudi Arabia? That makes no sense. Like, we should be just doing things at home as much as we can, creating jobs and keeping the money in Canada. So those are just some of the reasons why we support pipelines. Maybe in my follow-up I can get into more details. Thank you.
Thank you. Kaylin, you now have an additional minute to respond to what you've heard on the issues of climate and fossil fuels, if you wish.
The NDP is against the pipelines, but it has provided no alternative for Canadians as to how they will get their energy and fuel. How will we transport oil from one part of the country to the other? So the Conservatives will make it their priority to make pipelines that bring oil not just from coast to coast in Canada, but also to export markets, because like my colleague says, it's much better to use clean Canadian oil as opposed to oil that we're importing from Saudi Arabia and the United States, as we are right now. We deserve, sorry, that's all good.
Okay, thank you. Anjali, you now have 1 minute to respond to what you've heard.
The Conservative and the Liberal parties are engaging in a form of climate denial that belies their statements that climate change is real. The Conservative emissions target is only 30% reductions by 2050, and that plan would necessitate Canada pulling out of the internationally agreed upon Paris Agreement, which would put us on par with President Trump and other backwards leaders around the world. The Liberal plan is only very slightly better, but unfortunately they've made no progress towards it. And so we have two parties that are engaging in rhetoric that climate change is real, but in practice their policies are doing nothing to address it.
Thank you. Damien, you have an extra minute to respond.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll just add a few things here. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of hypocrisy when Liberal and NDP and Green politicians talk about climate change. You see Justin Trudeau flying around in 2 jumbo jets, and, Jagmeet Singh's not much better. He's driving around in a bus. They're burning fossil fuels. I think the only leader that's really serious about it is the Green Party leader, who just stays in her riding in Toronto. But, if we're really going to talk seriously about climate change and energy issues, we need to bring in topics like nuclear power, for instance. It's a perfect compromise. There's no CO2 emissions. It's the safest statistically form of energy, and it has the ability to meet our energy needs better than any other form of energy. We should also, if you're really serious about climate change, you should also focus energy on cities like Beijing, New Delhi, where people are dying from smog inhalations, things like that. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is on Indigenous issues. The City of Vancouver has recognized that we live on unceded Indigenous territories. Given that, would you support returning federal lands to the Indigenous nations, and how would you, as the MP for Vancouver Granville, pursue relations with the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples? We'll start with Anjali, and you have 2 minutes.
So, justice for Indigenous peoples is at the core of any meaningful climate plan, any meaningful inequality plan, and any meaningful, it should be at the core of any meaningful party platform or proposal for change. We've had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada uncover some very uncomfortable and disastrous truths about the colonial legacy of this country, and that's something that we need to grapple with. And a baseline, a starting point for that is implementing all 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. On a local level, as you mentioned in your question, we are on unceded lands of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh people, and those are nations that have their own governance, strong governance structures, and a right to this land that was unfairly taken from them. And so any decision-making around land and land stewardship should be done on a government-to-government, a nation-to-nation basis with the First Nations whose land it originally was and continues to be. And that's why I'm a firm proponent of the land back movement, because to me, land back encompasses the heart of climate justice. It acknowledges that Indigenous peoples kept this land in balance and stewarded it responsibly and sustainably for thousands and thousands of years. And so we need to allow for some of that wisdom and that leadership to guide our decision-making on land use and land stewardship and climate change. We need Indigenous peoples to lead us out of this crisis. And that's one of the first steps towards reconciliation and justice for past and ongoing genocide.
Thank you. Damien, you have 2 minutes to respond.
Thank you. Yeah, reconciliation, of course, but I think, obviously we need to go beyond that. First and foremost, getting clean drinking water to all communities, regardless of the cost. Everybody can agree with that. And I don't know how our government has failed to do that this far. But beyond that, there's a lot more we can do. And I think that, taking an approach where we consider all Canadians equal, which doesn't involve land givebacks or any of these policies. It's all about implementing a new approach based on respect, self-reliance, and prosperity for Indigenous communities. We want to eliminate any and all dependency on the federal government. We want to end a multi-billion-dollar industry of lawyers, politicians, and lobbyists that profit off the suffering of Indigenous communities. We want to empower Indigenous Canadians to take care of themselves, find deeper meaning through resource development, whether it's oil, LNG, forestry, food, animals, create jobs, and foster property ownership. One of the biggest issues on reserves is the state of homes and associated living conditions. We strongly believe that home ownership is required to create stability for families and improve living conditions. Home ownership directly results in improved conditions of homes because owners have a vested interest in maintaining them. And we believe that the Indian Act is a major barrier to this goal. As I mentioned earlier, I spoke with former elected chief of the Haisla Nation and current BC MLA, Ellis Ross, and he asserted that this is the case. So we would look at eliminating or radically altering the Indian Act. The Indian Act itself was written 150 years ago. Even with the updates, it's still outdated. And I think even a lot of progressives would agree that even just the name, the Indian Act, is inappropriate by today's standards. Thank you.
Thank you. Kaylin, you have 2 minutes.
The Conservatives respect treaty rights, and they understand that while the path to reconciliation is a long and difficult road, the time to make amends for past injustices is now, and we must act. We cannot wait another 6 years to provide the Indigenous community with clean drinking water. That's why the Conservatives are committed to making the right to clean drinking water a fundamental right. And we will work with We'll work closely with the Indigenous communities to make sure that we can quickly end the long-term drinking water advisories. Secondly, we'll work with the Indigenous communities as trusted and equal partners. We'll be a reliable partner in addressing their housing needs and to implement a for Indigenous, by Indigenous housing strategy that puts an end to the federal paternalism. We need to give the Indigenous people the autonomy to meet their own housing needs, first and foremost. And lastly, Canada's Conservatives will level the playing field and encourage Indigenous people, support their business success in the community. We'll be providing $4 million over 3 years in targeted funding for hiring and training of local regional economic development officers, and we'll be improving opportunities for Indigenous businesses to receive government contracts by setting active targets for departmental procurement officers.
Thank you. Anjali, you now have an additional minute if you'd like to respond to the other candidates on Indigenous issues.
I think that reconciliation and more appropriately justice goes far beyond piecemeal measures. And I think it acknowledges, I think we need to acknowledge that what has been laid out in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and in the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women shows that we still have such a long way to go. We still haven't addressed systemic racism against minorities and especially against Indigenous peoples in all our institutions, in our policing institution, and we cannot look at justice for Indigenous peoples without looking at basic care and basic needs for all, like medical and housing.
Thank you. Damien, you have an extra minute if you'd like to respond.
Sure. Yeah, I'd just like to read a few snippets from our platform, which express the same ideas, just a little more articulated a bit better, maybe. So the lack of real private property on reserves is in part responsible for the poor state of housing and social ills that derive from it, and is one of the greatest impediments to economic development. A People's Party government will explore further avenues to promote the establishment of individual property rights on reserves so as to empower its residents and give them increased control over their lives. A People's Party government will ensure Indigenous communities take ownership of the services they receive in partnership with Ottawa and other levels of government. Although Ottawa spends about $24 billion a year on Indigenous programs, there is little evidence that the living conditions have been improving in Indigenous communities. The federal government and Indigenous administrations have a responsibility to ensure that the taxpayers' money is well spent. A People's Party government will review federal spending to ensure programs are better targeted to benefit the Indigenous population, in particular communities that have the greatest needs.
Thank you. Kaylin, you now have 1 minute to respond.
The Conservatives acknowledge that in order to ensure economic prosperity for the Indigenous community, we need to give them the right to have a say as to what happens on their traditional lands. The Liberal government has paid lip service to this partnership. They've repeatedly failed to consult First Nations before canceling projects that have been approved and shutting down opportunities that would benefit First Nation and Indigenous communities. Canada's Conservatives will respect and uphold the rights of the Indigenous communities to pursue economic opportunities and benefit from the development of the resources of their traditional territories. In addition, we're going to be creating the Canadian Indigenous Opportunities Corporation that will support First Nations organizations seeking to purchase an equity stake in major projects. This will help. We will also be helping guarantee loans to Indigenous groups so that they can invest in natural resources.
Thank you, Kaylin. The next question is about the housing crisis. It's no secret that Vancouver's housing market has ballooned in recent years. What would be your top priority for restoring some semblance of affordability in the city's rental and housing markets? And would you be willing to adopt policies that would lower the value of housing overall in the city in order to bring down the cost of housing for those not yet in the market? We'll start with Damien, and you have 2 minutes.
Thank you. Just trying to get organized with my notes here. So yeah, with housing, our strategy is really based around cooling down an overheated market. So a big part of that is immigration. These two issues are intrinsically tied together. About 40% of immigrants to Canada end up settling in only two cities, Toronto or Vancouver, where the housing shortage is most acute. So, we've had record numbers of immigration this year, up to 400,000 we're on pace for, and that's the size of half a province in a single year. And that's largely distributed between two cities that are already struggling to keep up with housing and to keep housing costs down. So it's really largely a supply and demand issue. So we would like to get immigration down to a sustainable level of between 100,000 and 150,000 immigrants per year, which is still a lot by any measure. We think this would greatly reduce cool down the housing market by reducing demand. And another big one is modifying the Bank of Canada's inflation rate from 2% to 0%. This will cool down inflation across all sectors, including housing. Some other policies that we have are dismantling the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. It's a mammoth government agency that fuels the housing crisis instead of helping it cool down. And all it has ever done is encourage Canadians to buy homes they can't afford. So Canadians getting in on homes at 5%, subprime mortgage loans, things like that. We want to end those types of practices. Personally, some ideas that I have are, we've learned with COVID that we can work remotely. So I want to explore ideas of having people relocated to less costly parts of the country. I'll talk about that more in my next section.
Thank you. Anjali, you have 2 minutes to discuss the housing crisis.
So it's no secret that we are in a housing crisis. Canada leads the G7 nations in terms of fastest growing home prices, which is a shameful title to hold because it shows that we have a reckless and runaway housing market that has been the result of intentional policy decisions from the Liberal government and the Conservative government before them. It's clear that the policy choices of these two governments favor corporations and those who use the housing market as a stock market instead of helping everyday Canadians be able to afford homes and vulnerable Canadians to be able to afford rent. And so the NDP certainly supports measures to cool down this housing crisis. And those measures come in the form of an increased good supply of homes that are a mix of affordable and cooperative and mixed-use homes, as well as demand-side measures that would seek to close the tax loopholes that are allowing reckless practices like home flipping and speculation, and is in line with the shared Canadian value, once again, of paying our fair share. It's unfair that some get to profit massively from the housing market while others have a massive barrier to even entering that market. So homes are for living in, and housing should be a basic human right that should be provided to every Canadian.
Thank you. Kaylin, you have 2 minutes.
Canada faces a housing affordability crisis, and in the last 6 years, the Liberal government has failed to resolve this crisis, as noted by the Parliamentary Budget Officer, notwithstanding the $70 billion plus that the Liberals have spent on their housing strategy. This strategy has had limited impact on our actual housing needs. The limited impact of Liberals' housing strategy demonstrates that it's not a demand problem, contrary to what my colleague Damien suggests. It's a supply issue. We need to increase supply. We need to build as many affordable homes as quickly as possible. We need to create the environment where builders and developers can do that for the community, and that includes reducing red tape and reducing regulatory barriers, and we also need to reduce the cost of development and land costs. The Conservatives' housing plan commits to building 1 million 1 million homes over the next 3 years. We're the only party who has committed to releasing 15% of federally owned land for the purposes of developing them into affordable housing. And we're the only party that recognizes that housing needs a creative solution that collaborates with municipalities. And so on that end, the Conservatives will be requiring municipalities to increase density along key transit lines in order to receive any additional transit funding. Lastly, to free up existing inventory, the Conservatives were the first party to propose a ban on foreign ownership for at least the next 2 years for foreigners who do not intend to live in the home. We need real strategies to solve this housing affordability crisis, and that involves collaboration with both public and private sectors. As we've seen in the last 6 years, throwing money, billions of dollars at a problem does not result in good outcomes necessarily.
Thank you. Now, Damien, you have an extra minute to respond to anything that you've heard from your colleagues.
Thank you. So yeah, I just wanted to comment a little bit more about the role that the free market has to play in solving the housing crisis. So I remember a little anecdote about a friend of mine, a very progressive person, and she thought that she was entitled to just live wherever she wants. And that's simply not true. I mean, you can't just say, oh, I'm going to take up residence in Yaletown or Shaughnessy or Kitsilano. There's reasons why you can't just live wherever you want. And I think the city of Vancouver in general, the same logic applies. So, you know, sometimes you do have to move somewhere that your career takes you, or that your field or your finances allow for. So I think it's important to point that out. Another really quick thing I want to mention is nowadays we get the feeling that progressives do not want people to own property because it gives them independence and power. The government should not be in the business of being landlords. Everything the government runs is generally a massive failure. So the PPC wants to have smaller, less powerful government with a stronger nation. Thank you.
Damien. Anjali, you have 1 minute to respond to the housing crisis and anything that you have heard from your colleagues.
We need a massive federal investment in housing for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, that housing is a human right and that everyone should have access to an affordable home, not only to rent, but to have the chance to own their own home. And we won't do that by allowing for-profit housing companies or construction companies to build the same type of house over and over and expand into urban sprawl. What we need is different types of housing. We need denser neighborhoods. We need walkable communities. We need efficient, low-carbon housing that actually has multiple benefits, such as making our communities more walkable, less car dependent, getting to know our neighbors, being more resilient in times of trouble, like in the recent pandemic. And it's an indirect subsidy to the fossil fuel industry and to the car industry when we don't do that.
Thank you. Kaylin, you have an additional minute.
Well, my colleague from the NDP says that the right to property is a fundamental right, but currently it's not enshrined in our Constitution. So I'd like to hear from her how that's what the NDP's plan is going to be with respect to that. And also we should note that the NDP has a plan to increase the capital tax inclusions from 50 to 75% for assets across the board, including real property assets. So that will have an impact for owners who are planning to sell their property. And with respect to the Liberals' housing plan, well, they offer more or less the same. They offer the status quo. The Liberals' plans to build 1.4 million new homes is a bit inaccurate, because they actually define new homes as newly built or revitalized. And the Liberals also propose to subsidize developers with $600 million in taxpayer money.
Thank you. The next question is on gender equality. Much has been achieved in Canada towards gender equality, but there is still work to be done. What, in your view, are concrete steps the federal government still needs to take to achieve gender equality and justice in this country? We'll start with Anjali, and you have 2 minutes.
As a woman a professional woman and a woman entering politics, I'm all too familiar with some of the barriers that women still face, and not just women, but non-binary folks as well, and trans folks. And these are issues that require a multi-pronged approach. They are not overnight fixes, but recognizing that we need gender diversity in all institutions, and especially in government, is an absolutely critical first step. So reducing barriers for gender diverse people, especially women, to access our institutions and to access positions of power is the first way to go. And I don't have like a policy, a platform position on how to reduce the gender disparity, but it also begins with closing the wage gap as well, because unfortunately, as a developed country, we still have a yawning wage gap between men and women, and that's one of the first things to address.
Thank you very much. Kaylin, you have 2 minutes to respond.
Well, as a lawyer and a member of the new generation of professionals, I'm acutely aware of the challenges of the women who came before me, and I'm deeply appreciative of all their efforts. Historically, that has allowed me to not only vote, but to become a lawyer and to participate in this upcoming election as a candidate. I have a profound respect, and I feel a sense of responsibility to continue to champion the rights of women, not only in the workspace, but also just in the community. And the Conservatives have a strong record of supporting women, of enabling strong women to thrive, not only in government, but also in the community across all sectors, be it tech, finance, engineering, you name it. And the Conservatives will continue to commit to ensuring gender equality by implementing new programs that target lifting up the incomes of Canada's lowest 40%, which benefits girls and women disproportionately. We'll also be allowing Canada's child benefit to kick in at 7 months of pregnancy rather than at childbirth. And we'll be introducing a childcare plan that will enable women to choose to return to the workplace more quickly.
Thank you. Damien, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you. So, I mean, first of all, I think our efforts are a little bit misplaced. Jordan Peterson has talked a lot about wage gap, and he's debunked a lot of the rhetoric around that. I think it's a pretty widely misunderstood topic. Studies from Scandinavia have shown that the more equal you try to force a society to be, the less equal it becomes. So I think we need to take a step back and kind of rethink our approach on that. In terms of our leadership, being advocates for women, Justin Trudeau has a long history of inappropriate behavior with women, whether it's allegations of sexual assault or if it's the way he treated Jody Wilson-Raybould in this riding. I don't think that's somebody who, certainly not somebody I'm going to be lectured on when it comes to topics like gender issues. Now, I just want to take a little time and talk about what I consider to be the most important gender issue right now, and that's transgenderism in children. In particular, radical transgender ideology that's being imposed on our children in schools. And children are being encouraged to take puberty blockers and hormone blockers. 9 out of 10 of those children go on to regret their decisions. And it's not a decision that we believe that a child can consent to. So I think, we have our focus in the wrong place. We should be a little bit more worried about our children, what's being taught to them in schools, social contagions. If you read the works of Dr. Deborah Soh or Abigail Schreier, you can learn more about this, but I think that's the biggest issue right now when it comes to gender issues.
Anjali, you have 1 minute to respond to anything that you have heard.
First of all, I have to respond that that attitude towards the rights of transgender folks is an extremely violent one. I don't condone it. The NDP does not condone it. And actually, the pay gap in Canada is 32%. Canadian women make 32% on average less than men, and that gap is wider for immigrant women, racialized women, Indigenous women, and women with disabilities. So it is a significant issue to resolve, and it starts with prioritizing pay equity. Of course, childcare is a burden that falls disproportionately on women as well, and that's why the NDP advocates for a comprehensive childcare strategy that starts with $10 a day childcare.
Thank you. Kaylin, you have 1 minute to respond to anything that you have heard.
I agree with everything that my colleague from the NDP has said. I agree that wage disparity is a very real thing. I don't think it's something that is made up. And with respect to leadership, I think the record speaks for itself. The Conservative Party, we helped build, the first female Canadian Prime Minister in Canada is a Conservative woman. In contrast, a very strong Justice Minister in the Liberal Party found it to be a difficult place, a very toxic environment to work in the Liberal government. So I think the record speaks for itself. The Conservatives are committed to gender equality, and they're also committed to meritocracy and ensuring that women who are intelligent, hardworking, and strong have a voice in government and have a voice across all our sectors in Canada.
Thank you. Damien, you have the last word on how your party would achieve gender equality between men and women. You have 1 minute.
So again, I just want to reiterate that the most important issue right now is with children. And it's not about violence towards trans people. If you're
What is your party's policy on gender equality or creating gender equality between men and women?
Do you want me to read it to you? Because we have a
That's the
policy.
question. I'd just like you to answer the question.
So our policy is transgender people, we have no issue with that. If you're an adult, you have the right to make your choice, okay? It's children that we're worried about.
That's not the question. The question is, what is your party's policy on creating gender equality between men and women?
Our policy is freedom. People have the freedom to choose what they want to do for work. And if that creates a wage gap, that's called freedom. So that's our policy.
Okay, thank you. The final question is about something that is particular to this riding. And one of the reasons so many people across Canada are watching Vancouver Granville. Jody Wilson-Raybould, the outgoing MP for this riding, was elected last time as an independent after her disagreement and falling out with Prime Minister Trudeau. Jody won election twice and remains well regarded in Vancouver Granville. This question is for each candidate. Why do you think you are best positioned and best qualified to take over the seat occupied by Jody Wilson-Raybould? There will only be one round on this question, 2 minutes each, and we will go in alphabetical order, beginning with Anjali.
Jody Wilson-Raybould left a strong legacy in Vancouver Granville, and I've been hearing about this legacy at the doors and on the streets as I talk to voters. The riding is so grateful for her leadership because she brought a clear-eyed, principled approach that was about integrity and that was about self-knowledge and standing in her truth, even when a corrupt political system sought to move her away from her truth. And so the legacy that she leaves in Vancouver Granville is about electing a candidate that is willing to stand by their principles even when they're pressured to do otherwise by the political system and by the legal system even. And so she was a brilliant truth teller and continues to be a brilliant truth teller. And so I hope to follow in her footsteps by being someone who also is willing to stand in my truth and who comes from a principled stance when it comes to what I believe to be just and right for all Canadians. What I've been hearing at the doors in Vancouver Granville is that they want someone who will have courage in in a fraught political landscape. And I believe that the campaign that I've brought together is fundamentally about courage. And it's about having the boldness to make political choices that are in the interest of the common good and that are good for all Canadians and that prioritize justice at their core.
Thank you. Kaylin, you have 2 minutes.
Well, I think as a woman who is also of a minority who practices in the legal profession, I have tremendous respect for Jody Wilson and everything that she's done for this community. It takes real courage and gumption to do what she did in the Liberal government, to stand up for what she thought was right and to speak out and to maintain her position. I think that history will show that she was right. If we look at the laws and the Constitution, she certainly was right, and so it was very bold of her to be strong and be strong-willed. And I think that I'm well positioned to serve this community and to be a strong advocate for this community. I've listened and I've served many seniors, families, and businesses in BC and particularly in Vancouver Granville. And I've worked hard to serve their interests, sometimes even when it may not be politically popular at the time. And so I think I'm confident that I will be able to bring the same sort of work ethic if I have the honor of being elected.
Thank you. Damien, why do you think you are best positioned and qualified to take over the seat occupied by Jody Wilson-Raybould? You have 2 minutes.
Thanks for the question. So first of all, I have tremendous respect for Jody Wilson-Raybould as well. I think what she was trying to do with exposing the SNC-Lavalin affair was righteous and just. And, that's something we've seen again and again with the Trudeau Liberals. It's scandal after scandal, right? I respected what she did. I respected her standing up to Justin Trudeau. And I think that I have the courage to do the same if put in that position. With respect to that particular affair that she was trying to prosecute, our party's policy is to end corporate welfare and crony capitalism. And to end things like money laundering through the housing system in places like Vancouver. So I think, we've got great policies there, but really what we need right now is some fiscal responsibility. And I think in addition to opposing the vaccine passports, so those are the two big things right now from my perspective. And I think, we're the only party that opposes the vaccine passports, and we're the only party that has a fiscally responsible plan. By far, those are the two most important things for Canada right now. And so that's why I think that I would be best suited to take over for Jody Wilson-Raybould. Thank you.
We will now hear closing remarks from each candidate. Each candidate has 2 minutes to sum up their pitch to voters in Vancouver Granville. We will start in reverse alphabetical order. So Damien, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you. So just with respect to COVID and the pandemic, which we didn't really talk much about tonight, I think it's important to bring that up. Again, we are the only party that opposes the vaccine passports. We think that it's fundamentally against our constitutional rights as laid out in the Bill of the Charter of Rights by Pierre Trudeau himself. That's a big one for us. We also need to be asking questions about COVID. Why aren't we looking more at things like rapid testing? Myself, I'm not vaccinated. Neither is my wife, neither is my mother. We made personal choices. I made my personal choice based on my health history. I have a history of lymphoma, and I already had COVID, and studies are coming out showing that, if you already had COVID, you have a higher immunity than being vaccinated. So why aren't we talking more about these? Why aren't we asking questions? And why aren't we respecting the protesters' right to voice their opinions on the vaccine passports? I know that's not popular with everyone in the riding, but I think there's a good chunk of us, probably 20 to 30%, that feel that our rights and freedoms are being infringed upon. So if you're concerned about freedom, if you're concerned about freedom of speech, if you're concerned about fiscal responsibility, if you're concerned about the future of our country and you don't want to see your children and your children's children riddled with debt, I implore you to check out our platform at peoplespartyofcanada.ca. Thank you.
Now we'll go to Kaylin. You have 2 minutes to share with us your closing remarks.
We simply cannot afford more of the same. We cannot afford more reckless spending that would leave Canada with high levels of debt and unemployment. This election is about who has the best plan to get Canada back on track, to get back on its feet, and to rebuild our economy, our jobs, and our way of life. On September 20th, Canadians have a stark choice. They have to choose between more reckless spending, more broken promises, or they can choose real action and real solutions to the problems we face today. I'm confident that as your Member of Parliament, together with the Conservative Party of Canada, we'll be able to bring the change that this country needs to resolve the challenges facing many of the residents in this riding, including issues relating to affordability, housing, economic recovery, climate change, and mental health. If elected, I'm committed to serving as a strong voice in Ottawa for this community, and I pledge to be accessible and responsive to your needs. Thank you for your time, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. And Anjali, you have 2 minutes.
First of all, I would love to thank UCV for hosting us today, for having us here. It's a real honor to engage in the democratic process this way, and I want to thank you, Diane, for being such a compassionate moderator. I have heard from the voters of Vancouver Granville who I've been speaking with and getting to engage with, and this is a real privilege for me to be able to hear so many people's stories and so many people's longings for change. And what I've heard in Vancouver Granville so far is that people want change, and that living through the pandemic, we really began to see that our economic model is broken fundamentally. It's not working for the majority of Canadians, and it's certainly not delivering what Canadians need to live happy and fulfilled lives. It concentrates wealth at the very top. It rewards those at the very top, and working people are left to pay the price. And so I've heard that this veil has been dropped and the people of Vancouver Granville want better. We will not solve the housing crisis, the inequality crisis, and certainly not the climate crisis through incremental measures and through piecemeal measures. We need a bold and courageous approach, and that is true fiscal responsibility that will ripple out into all corners of the country and the economy and is good for all Canadians. And we need to do this through a justice-centered approach that leaves no one behind. As your MP, I will be committed to working tirelessly for these ideals and to a process of constant listening, a constant conversation with the people of Vancouver Granville so that I can serve better.
Well, thank you very much. That concludes our All Candidates Forum for Vancouver Granville. And on behalf of the Vancouver Unitarians, I would like to thank all of our candidates for joining us this evening. And best of luck to whomever wins the honor of representing this riding in Parliament. I would also like to mention, because I didn't do so at the top of this event, that UCV is a welcoming congregation. We welcome all sexual orientations, identities, cultural backgrounds, ages, and physical and mental abilities. We are also committed to working with people who identify as BIPOC in helping to transform the white colonial patriarchy in which we all live into something equitable and compassionate. So thank you for joining us tonight on our live stream, and a reminder that the full forum will be available at this same link for sharing with friends and neighbors and family who couldn't be here tonight. And we hope you will all encourage others to engage in this vital democratic process. Don't forget to vote next Monday. Thank you and good night.